15 seconds on live television. That was all it took for Jasmine Crockett to turn a packed studio in Los Angeles from polite laughter into absolute, breathless silence. Under the blinding lights, with cameras rolling and millions watching, a single line slipped from her lips. Calm, sharp, unshaken. In that instant, Bill Maher, the man who built his career on quick sarcasm and control of the stage, froze. His smirk cracked, his rhythm collapsed, and the audience, 300 strong, sat stunned, caught between disbelief and awe. But here's the truth. This wasn't just about a witty exchange, not just another viral moment to be clipped and replayed. For many Americans, especially those who have lived through decades of injustice, dismissal, and silencing, it felt like more, like a mirror being held up to power. Was it simply a comeback, or was it the beginning of something larger? Something America has quietly ignored for far too long. And before we continue, a reminder. Though this retelling adds layers of drama and storytelling, the emotions, the struggles, and the lessons drawn from moments like these are very real. Because sometimes, fiction only sharpens the truth. CBS Television City always looked different from the inside. From the sidewalk, it glittered with neon signs and the promise of laughter. But once the security doors slid shut behind her, Jasmine Crockett felt the air change. It wasn't heavy or cold in temperature. It was cold in intention. Polished walls, two clean floors, a silence that pressed instead of soothed. She moved down a hallway lined with framed photographs of the so-called legends. Black and white portraits of men, hosts in tailored suits, smiles fixed just enough to suggest authority. Their eyes seemed to follow her as if to whisper, "We define the rules here. Who are you to bend them?" Jasmine clocked every detail the way a trial lawyer does. The scuffed tape excesses where guests had once been ordered to stand. The faint musk of burnt coffee mixed with hairspray. The laminated quiet on set signs taped at every turn. She passed a group of assistants clustered near a doorway. They were mid-laughter, the bright kind that bounces off tile, until they saw her. The sound clipped in half, as if someone had cut the cord on a speaker. One fiddled with a headset, another studied a clipboard with religious devotion. None of them looked her in the eye. Jasmine didn't need an explanation. She'd lived that silence before. In courtrooms, in committee hearings, in rooms where her presence was tolerated, but her power wasn't welcome. A production runner appeared at her elbow. "Right this way, Congresswoman." The words were perfectly polite, but the tone was careful, almost rehearsed. He led her into a dressing room marked with her name on a flimsy paper insert. Inside, a mirror ringed with bulbs too harsh to be flattering, a couch so stiff it looked allergic to comfort, a single bottle of water placed label forward, as if product placement mattered more than her presence. The air smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant, evidence of a room scrubbed of humanity. It wasn't cold to the touch. It was cold in atmosphere, like a stage set after the actors had gone home. Jasmine lowered herself into the chair. She didn't exhale in relief. She tested the seat, as if checking for cracks. Her phone buzzed. Reese, her aide. "They've moved you to segment B for flow." She read it twice. Flow meant order. Order meant control. Control meant they'd already mapped out how tonight should look and how she was supposed to sound. Somewhere in the corridor, laughter bubbled again, distant and jagged. She heard a sentence tossed like a paper airplane. "You just keep it lively." Then, footsteps. As she stepped out to glance at the wall clock, the laughter stopped mid-note. A producer in a black blazer brushed by, offering a quick smile with no teeth. "We'll bring you out after the opener," she said. "You'll love it." It didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like choreography. Back in the mirror, the bulbs cut sharp lines across her reflection, jaw set, blazer smooth, eyes steady. She touched the unopened water bottle, then let it go. She understood now. This silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. constructed, like stage lighting. The same way a courtroom can make you feel smaller than the judge. This green room was designed to corner her before she ever reached the stage. A knock at the door. The runner again. 2 minutes. Jasmine rose. She adjusted her blazer sleeve, habit of a woman who had stood in front of juries that wanted her voice quiet. She stepped into the hallway. The assistants shifted like birds scattering from a shadow. She caught a whisper. Seat her far right. Camera 2. Far right meant a tighter shot. Tighter shots meant every micro-expression magnified. Every flicker of irritation ready to be repackaged as anger. And that's when the realization hit her. Not as dread, but as clarity. This wasn't just a room. It was an architecture of silence. They didn't invite her here for balance. They invited her here for a clip. She walked toward the light anyway. Not to avoid the trap, but to meet it head on, already measuring the edges of the silence, already deciding which part of it would belong to her. The knock on the door still echoed when Jasmine's mind flicked back to the phone call that had come 2 nights earlier. It was late, after another 14-hour day of committee hearings, inbox fires, and hometown requests that never seemed to slow. Her comms director, an old friend who rarely wasted words, had called with a voice pitched lower than usual. "Listen," he said, "I need you to hear me without interruption. The invitation sounds polite, but it isn't. They're billing it as a conversation on civility and polarization. That's not what it is. It's bait." Jasmine had leaned against her kitchen counter, staring at the half-drunk cup of coffee that had gone cold hours before. She let him talk, because deep down she already knew. They'll frame you as the firebrand, the outburst waiting to happen. That's the clip they're chasing. She remembered answering with silence, not because she had no reply, but because silence sometimes carried more weight than words. It wasn't the first time she'd been given that warning. Every panel, every interview, every town hall debate came dressed in civility, all smiles and small talk at the beginning. A handshake here, a compliment there, and then the ambush. Almost theatrical. She could replay them in her mind like court transcripts. The senator who opened with, "You're so articulate," before dismissing her argument 2 minutes later. The host who insisted he wanted an honest exchange, then cut her mic when her honesty made him sweat. The debate partner who smiled warmly backstage only to smirk on air, knowing the cameras loved his grin more than her facts. Each time, she had held her tone steady. Each time, she felt the invisible toll it exacted, the emotional tax of being measured by standards no one else had to meet. Too loud, and she was angry. Too calm, and she was cold. Too passionate, and she was unprofessional. Too composed, and she was detached. The balance was impossible, designed to be impossible. And yet, here she was again, about to walk into another room where civility was a stage prop and her presence the unspoken target. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror once more. The powder blue blazer had been chosen deliberately, striking enough to stand out, soft enough to deflect claims of aggression, a subtle shade but calculated. She knew that before a word left her lips, before the first camera cut, the narrative had already been drafted by someone else. Tonight's show would not be about civility. It would be about who had the power to define it. The memory of her comms director's final warning lingered. They'll smile while they set the trap. That's the part that stings. He wasn't wrong. Jasmine had lived through too many polite ambushes to pretend otherwise. The cruelty rarely came with a raised voice. It came gift-wrapped in laughter, in jokes the audience wasn't sure they should laugh at, in the casual shrug of someone who knew the system tilted their way. She inhaled, slow and deliberate, feeling her chest rise against the fitted blazer. The hum of the studio beyond the green room wall seeped in. Footsteps, a burst of laughter, the quick shuffle of papers. Each sound carried a message. You are entering their territory. You are stepping onto their stage. And yet, beneath the nerves, beneath the rehearsed hostility she expected, there was a flicker of clarity. A stage could be a trap, Yes, but it could also be a spotlight. That was the paradox she carried with her, like a second skin. The very platform built to shrink her could just as easily magnify her. And tonight, in the pit between silence and performance, she wondered, what exactly would the trap look like this time? And who would really be caught in it? The hallway leading from the green room to the studio felt longer than it was. A straight corridor, maybe 40 paces at most, but dressed in history that pressed against her with every step. Along the walls hung glossy black and white portraits of the men who had ruled these rooms before her. Talk show icons with arched eyebrows and cocked smiles. Late-night kings frozen in poses of confidence. Their images were framed like courtroom evidence. Look who belongs here. Look who shaped the story. Jasmine studied them as she walked, her heels tapping steady on the tile. They never had to shrink their voices, she thought. None of these men had been warned to keep their tone light, their words measured. Their anger softened so it didn't scare the audience. They spoke and the world leaned in. She spoke and the world weighed her tone before her point. A production assistant walked half a step behind her, headset crackling with cues from the booth. 2 minutes, he whispered, as if even time itself required secrecy. Jasmine didn't nod. She didn't break stride. The phrase repeated in her mind, not as pressure, but as possibility. 2 minutes until the lights. 2 minutes until the stage was no longer theirs to choreograph. The air grew denser the closer she came to the double doors. From beyond, she could hear the muffled roar of the crowd warming up, laughter fed by a warm-up comic, the hum of cameras repositioning, the shuffle of stage hands moving props. The rhythm of it all reminded her of trial days, the clerk arranging files, jurors shifting in their seats, the faint buzz that swelled before the judge entered. A room primed to decide who would be heard, and on what terms. She glanced once more at the portraits on the wall. Their eyes seemed to follow her, but not with welcome, with challenge, as if the very walls whispered, "We set the rules here. You are only a guest." For a flicker of a second, the weight pressed against her sternum, but then clarity cut through. They were only pictures, relics of a past that thought it was permanent. Tonight was proof it wasn't. Her mind moved quickly through the warnings. Her comms director's voice, the quiet green room, the assistants who refused eye contact. All of it added up to one truth. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a setup, but clarity sharpened her nerves into something else. She felt it in the way her breath steadied instead of quickening, in the way her hands remained open and loose at her sides. She was not walking into a trap unaware. She was walking into a stage she could bend. At the end of the corridor, the doors stood ajar. Beyond them, a sliver of brightness cut into the shadow. The hum of the crowd swelled, joined now by the recognizable chords of the theme song. An assistant adjusted her mic pack, tugging the wire into place. "You're up after his monologue," he said softly. She gave a polite smile, not for him but for herself. The last thought she carried before stepping into the light was not fear, not doubt, but recognition. This night could be reduced to a clip, a soundbite for headlines, or it could become something else, something heavier. The difference would depend on her stillness, her precision, her refusal to be small. She straightened her blazer, let the powder blue catch the dim backstage glow, and stepped forward. 2 minutes had become one. Then the doors opened wider, and the stage was hers to claim. The lights snapped on like a gavel striking wood, and in that instant, the stage belonged to Bill Maher. He leaned forward in his chair, the faint smirk of someone who had rehearsed this moment long before the cameras rolled. "Our next guest," he said, his tone a blend of welcome and warning, "is sharp, ambitious, maybe even the future of her party, unless her emotions get in the way." The words were dressed as wit, delivered with the cadence of a joke, but the sting was obvious. The audience chuckled, not a roar, just a polite ripple, the kind of laughter that signals complicity more than humor. Jasmine Crockett crossed one leg over the other and folded her hands lightly in her lap. The blazer caught the light just as she had intended. its calm powder blue refusing to shout, even while his words attempted to shrink her. She smiled, polite, measured, almost practiced, but behind her eyes, calculation. She had expected something like this. The jab wasn't clever, it was predictable. The kind of line that could only draw breath in a room used to dismissing women who did not apologize for their presence. The pause that followed was not accidental. Jasmine let the laughter stretch just a beat longer than comfort allowed. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were considering whether the introduction had been meant for her or for some caricature drawn by his pen. Then she said, evenly, "Good to be here." No elaboration, no forced laugh, no defensive qualifier, just 4 words, steady enough to remind anyone listening that she was not here to play the role he had cast. Maher shifted in his chair, fingers tapping once against the armrest. His rhythm had expected a return volley, some flustered denial, a witty protest he could spin into a bigger laugh. Instead, he got silence, the kind that expands between people until one of them blinks. The cameras caught it too, his smirk pausing for half a second, Jasmine's calm face holding the space with a composure that unsettled because it revealed nothing. The audience murmured faintly, unsure whether to expect another joke or a confrontation. Some leaned forward, drawn by the tension they couldn't quite name. Silence on live television has a gravity all its own. It makes every breath, every blink, feel louder. Jasmine knew this. She had wielded it in courtrooms where jurors needed time to realize the weight of her argument. Now, she let it work here, in a studio where silence was supposed to belong only to the host. Maher cleared his throat softly, disguising the crack in tempo as a segue. "Well," he said, forcing his grin back into place, "let's start simple then." Room, but the damage was already done. For the first time in the exchange, it was his job to recover the flow. Jasmine had taken the sting of his opening jab and dissolved it without even raising her voice. The twist wasn't in what she said, but in what she withheld. By refusing to meet sarcasm with sarcasm, she turned the spotlight onto his intention instead of her reaction. The smile she wore wasn't one of amusement. It was one of restraint, of a woman who understood the trap and chose to let it spring empty. The cameras, the crowd, even Maher himself might not have fully realized it yet, but the balance had shifted. The first strike had landed, but not where he thought. It wasn't her composure on trial. It was his. And for the first time in a long time, Bill Maher found himself in the uncomfortable silence of a stage he no longer entirely owned. Maher leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against the cue card in his hand as if the rhythm itself could guide the conversation. He tilted his head, half grin returning, voice sharpened with that trademark blend of sarcasm and condescension. "Tell me, Congresswoman, why do progressives these days feel the need to moralize everything? Every debate turns into a sermon, every issue a lecture. Don't you think people are tired of being preached at?" His tone dripped with casual amusement, but the edge was unmistakable. The audience chuckled again, lighter this time, less certain. Some laughed because they thought they were supposed to, others because Maher's confidence carried them there. But the room also carried a hum, a slight unease, as though they sensed the trap hidden beneath the joke. Jasmine didn't flinch. She adjusted her posture slightly, hands still folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm. Then, with a slow nod, she answered, "Moralizing? I think what you really mean is standing up for the people who don't usually get heard." Her voice wasn't raised, but the clarity cut through the studio like glass. It wasn't defensive, it was reframing, shifting the center of gravity. The chuckles in the crowd thinned. A few heads turned, watching her more closely now. Maher smirked, leaning in with practiced ease. "Right, but don't you think passion gets in the way of governing? There's a lot of yelling, not a lot of results. It looks less like leadership and more like performance. Everyone trying to go viral instead of get things done." Another ripple of polite laughter traveled across the seats. Maher's rhythm was back, or so he thought. His words dangled in the air, inviting her to overreact, to fit the very mold he was sketching for her. Jasmine tilted her head again, the faintest hint of a smile playing at her lips. Interesting, she said softly, how quickly passion becomes a dirty word when it belongs to people like me. She let the sentence hang. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes trained on Maher, but her voice broad enough to claim the whole room. Young people, especially young women, and especially young black women, are called emotional when we care too much, or angry when we speak directly. Meanwhile, someone else can lose their temper on live television, curse at their opponent, and it's called passion. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. Somewhere in the back rows, someone whispered, under their breath. Another voice muttered, that's true. The murmurs spread like a current, subtle but undeniable. Maher's smile faltered for just a flicker before he masked it with a shrug. He tried to wave it off. You're making this about identity. I'm talking about approach. People want solutions, not lectures. But the balance had shifted again. Jasmine didn't let him redirect. Her eyes held steady, her tone unshaken. Identity is part of approach, she replied. If you've spent your life watching your community overlooked, underfunded, blamed for problems it didn't create, what do you expect people to sound like when they finally get the mic? Soft? This time, the audience didn't laugh. They didn't clap either. They simply listened, leaning into the weight of the moment. That was more powerful than applause. The trap Maher had set, painting her as too emotional, too moralizing, had snapped shut on empty air. The twist was subtle but decisive. By refusing to take the bait, Jasmine had flipped the frame. She hadn't argued for passion. She had revealed the double standard that defined it. And in doing so, she left Maher standing not as a sharp critic, but as a man defending a bias he hadn't expected to be named out loud. Maher adjusted his tie in a subtle motion, a gesture more for himself than for the audience. His smirk returned, thinner this time, as if he was trying to reassert control with posture alone. Let's not make this about identity, he said, his tone carrying that practiced blend of dismissal and authority. The words landed like a closing statement, intended to box her in, to narrow the scope of the conversation before it slipped out of his hands. Jasmine didn't blink. Her shoulders remained relaxed, but her eyes sharpened. You can't separate identity from approach, she replied evenly, each syllable deliberate. The way we lead, the way we govern, the way we even enter a room, it's shaped by the lives we've lived. Pretending otherwise isn't neutral. It's dishonest. The studio air tightened, as if oxygen itself had paused. The polite chuckles of earlier segments were gone. The audience leaned in now, not out of habit, but anticipation. Even the hum of the stage lights seemed louder in the silence that followed. Maher's show thrived on keeping control, on timing laughter and applause like instruments in his hand. But now, the rhythm was slipping, and everyone felt it. Maher leaned forward, trying to pull the spotlight back. But Congresswoman, he said, adopting the tone of reason, policy has to work for everyone. When you filter it through identity, doesn't that risk dividing people instead of bringing them together? He looked toward the crowd as he spoke, inviting them to nod with him. A few did, but the response was muted, cautious. Jasmine's voice came calm but cutting. Identity isn't the division, she said. It's the reality. If a policy ignores who gets left out, who gets overlooked, who gets harmed, it's already dividing us. The only difference is whether we admit it. She let her gaze sweep across the audience, not in theatrics but in acknowledgement. If a community's been underfunded for decades, underrepresented in the halls of power, dismissed when they ask for more, why should they be expected to sound grateful and gentle when they finally demand fairness? A ripple moved through the audience, not laughter, not applause, but that low murmur of recognition, the kind that comes when a truth strikes too close to deny. Maher opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching for a pivot. He tapped his cue card against his knee once, then twice. He tried to regain footing. But isn't there a danger, he pressed, That every disagreement gets painted as prejudice? That we stop talking about solutions because we're too busy talking about feelings? The words sounded reasonable, but weaker than before. Jasmine tilted her head, almost gently, as if examining a case she had already won. "It's not about feelings," she replied. "It's about facts. If people in some neighborhoods wait 2 hours to vote while others wait 10 minutes, that's not a feeling. If a school can't afford textbooks while the next district builds a new stadium, that's not a feeling. Ignoring those realities doesn't make them go away. It just makes them invisible to people who don't live them." The audience murmured louder now, and one or two clapped before quickly lowering their hands. Maher shifted in his chair, attempting a smile, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed him. The twist was clear. Even if unspoken, the conversation was no longer orbiting around his questions. Jasmine was steering it, reshaping it with each response, turning what was meant as a jab into a lens aimed back at him. For the first time in the segment, it was Bill Maher who looked like the guest on his own stage. Bill Maher shifted in his chair, resting one ankle on the opposite knee, like a man preparing to deliver his verdict. His fingers tapped twice against the armrest, a habit of someone who loved to signal control. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that rehearsed cadence, half smug, half teacherly, the tone of a man who believed he already knew the answer. "But Congresswoman," he said, leaning back with a deliberate pause, "isn't leadership about being able to take criticism without calling it oppression?" The words rolled across the studio with the weight of a closing argument. A small burst of laughter rippled through the audience. Not the bright kind from earlier, but a nervous chuckle, as if people weren't sure whether they'd just heard a clever question or a condescending trap. Maher sat back, confident. This was his rhythm, the one that had carried him through decades of sparring with politicians and celebrities. His smirk suggested he believed he'd landed the punch. Jasmine didn't move. Not a blink, not a twitch of her folded hands. She sat in her powder blue blazer, eyes fixed on him, gaze steady enough to unsettle without words. The silence stretched, 2 seconds, then 3, then longer still. The cameras didn't cut away. They lingered on her face, on the calm that defied the energy of his jab. The audience began to shift in their seats, the nervous laughter dying quickly as the stillness thickened. Silence on live television was not supposed to last this long. Maher cleared his throat lightly, as if to prod her into responding, but Jasmine stayed unmoved. It wasn't hesitation, it wasn't uncertainty, it was choice, the power of refusing to meet sarcasm with instant rebuttal. She had learned long ago, in hearings and trials and town halls, that sometimes the loudest answer is no answer at all. The pause became its own spectacle. In the quiet, viewers at home would lean closer, waiting, hearts quickening because silence forces the imagination to run wild. In the studio, you could almost hear the hum of the stage lights, the faint shuffle of a cameraman repositioning. Maher's smirk began to strain, just a fraction, his eyes flicking briefly toward the crowd as if to confirm they were still with him. For the first time, he wasn't driving the moment. When Jasmine finally moved, it was not dramatic. She simply tilted her head, slightly, as if studying him the way one studies a witness whose testimony has just contradicted itself. She drew a breath, slow and deliberate, but she still didn't speak. The message was clear. Your trap isn't worth rushing into. The audience, sensing the reversal, grew quieter still. That hush, pregnant with anticipation, belonged to her now. She had turned his question into dead air, his smugness into discomfort. What was meant to corner her had begun to expose him instead. It was a tactic as old as debate itself, but rarely executed with such precision. By holding back, Jasmine had shifted the burden of the moment onto him. Every second she withheld her answer. The more his words sounded less like wisdom and more like a provocation hanging unanswered in the air. The twist was subtle but unmistakable. Bill Maher had crafted the perfect trap line, one he thought would box her into a defensive rant. But Jasmine refused to grant him the satisfaction. She sat in silence, turning absence into authority, until the room began to realize this wasn't his stage anymore. The pause was long enough to sting, long enough that the audience began to realize they weren't simply watching a debate. They were watching a power struggle fought in inches of silence. Jasmine let the moment breathe until it almost threatened to snap. Then, finally, she leaned forward just enough to reclaim the space. Her voice dropped low, deliberate, each word sharpened like glass. "If I explain systemic injustice," she said slowly, "and your first instinct is to call it victimhood, what does that say about how you listen?" The words cut through the studio like a blade gliding across silk. Not loud, not rushed, but calibrated, meant to pierce without theatrics. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was dead silence. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the shuffling of feet. The studio audience, trained to laugh, clap, or groan on cue, sat utterly still. The camera, almost instinctively, held on Maher's face. For the first time that night, his expression shifted in real time. The smirk he carried like armor faltered just slightly. His lips pressed together, his eyes darting for a fraction of a second, not away from her, but inward, as if his brain was scrambling for the next line while knowing none would land cleanly. The audience saw it. The viewers at home would see it too. Jasmine didn't lean back. She let the stillness thicken, her posture steady, gaze unflinching. The point wasn't just what she said, it was how she refused to dilute it with nervous laughter or extra commentary. She had drawn a line across the stage with a single sentence, and suddenly it wasn't Bill Maher's rhythm anymore. It was hers. Someone in the back row let out a low, involuntary, "mmm." A murmur rippled faintly through the crowd, not the restless shifting of boredom, but the almost physical reaction people have when truth lands heavy in a room. It wasn't applause yet, but it was momentum, building on her terms. Maher tried to regain footing. He gave a half shrug, a gesture meant to minimize, but his timing was off. "That's one way to look at it," he muttered, forcing his smirk back into place. But the line sounded hollow. The silence that had followed Jasmine's words still lingered, filling the space where his authority had once resided. Jasmine allowed the attempt to pass without response. That was the brilliance of it. By not piling on, by refusing to over-explain, she left his shrug dangling naked, a weak defense against a sharper truth. The trap he had built had sprung shut, but he was the one caught in it. The audience began to sense it too. The balance of the room had tilted. They weren't watching a guest struggling to justify herself. They were watching a host trying not to lose the very control he was famous for. And the realization, unspoken but shared, gave the moment its electricity. The twist was clear. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, hadn't cracked a joke, hadn't played into the spectacle. She had done something rare. She had seized the stage with calmness, not volume, with precision, not performance. And in doing so, she'd shown everyone in the room, from the front row to the control booth, that power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered and left the other side scrambling in the silence. Maher regrouped, sitting forward again, unwilling to let the silence define the exchange. He flipped the cue card in his hand like a shield and tried one last swing. "Look," he said, his voice sharper now, "you talk a lot about how hard it is for women like you. But isn't part of leadership being able to take the heat? To prove you can stay civil without turning every disagreement into a claim of oppression?" It was a line designed to sting, to force her into the very role he'd scripted, defensive, emotional, too sensitive. He smiled faintly, waiting for her to lash out, but Jasmine didn't. She turned slightly, not toward him, but toward the audience. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not theatrically, but deliberately, acknowledging their presence, pulling them into the conversation. Then she spoke, measured, clear. "I am being civil," she said. She let the words settle for half a beat before finishing. "I'm just not being small." The sentence cracked the air. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of years condensed into a single refusal to shrink. For a moment, the silence returned. But it was different now, charged, alive. Then it broke, not with nervous laughter, but with the clap of a single pair of hands in the second row. Another joined, then another. Within seconds. Half the room was applauding, the sound building like a wave. Maher tried to wave them down, hand flicking in mock control, but his smirk didn't land. His notes shuffled a little too quickly, his posture a shade too tight. The cameras caught it, a host trying to recover, a guest who didn't need to. Jasmine sat back slowly, adjusting her blazer sleeve, her expression unchanged. She didn't bask in the applause. She didn't lean forward to press the advantage. The strength of the line wasn't in its volume, but in its restraint. She had said enough. The rest was for the room to carry. The audience felt it. They weren't reacting to a clapback or a viral zinger. They were reacting to the unmistakable presence of a boundary being drawn in real time. For the women in the audience who had been told to smile more, for the men who had seen their wives and daughters dismissed for speaking directly, for anyone who had ever shrunk themselves to fit into a room, those 7 words echoed like a bell. The twist wasn't just that Jasmine had silenced Maher. It was that she had refused to play his game at all. She hadn't matched his sarcasm with sarcasm. She hadn't raised her voice to compete with his. She had simply redrawn the terms of civility, and in doing so, revealed the smallness of the frame he'd tried to trap her in. As the applause died down, the cameras caught Maher leaning back, letting out a breath that landed somewhere between a scoff and a surrender. He reached for his next cue card, but the rhythm was gone. The studio knew it. The viewers at home would know it too. And Jasmine, calm, steady, unmoved, sat in the silence she had made her own. The applause was still echoing when the stage manager cut to commercial and guided Jasmine off the set. The lights dimmed, the theme music hummed faintly, and the door to backstage closed behind her with a heavy click. For the first time in an hour, she wasn't staring into the brightness of cameras, but the shadowed hum of corridors where only crew moved. She exhaled slowly, loosening her shoulders, preparing herself for the ordinary quiet that follows every performance. But the quiet didn't last. Her assistant, Reese, barreled toward her with his phone in hand, eyes wide as if he'd just witnessed a fire break out. "You're trending," he blurted, nearly breathless. "Already, like, right now." He shoved the phone into her palm, on the screen. Her face filled the timeline in dozens of clips, some shaky from audience members, others crisp from the broadcast. All of them replayed the same moment, her steady eyes, her calm voice, the words, "I'm not being small," looping again and again in short bursts that had already been set to music, captioned in bold white font, transformed into GIFs ready to circulate endlessly. Jasmine swiped down, watching the flood pour in. Hashtags bloomed across the top of the feed. Not small, and actually Crockett vs. Maher, das civil and strong. The comments scrolled faster than she could read. That line will be quoted for years. Finally, someone said it. This is how you handle arrogance on TV. Each notification stacked on the last until the device itself vibrated in her hand like a pulse. Reese grinned nervously. It's not just political Twitter. It's everyone. Sports accounts, teachers, even celebrities. People are eating it up. The buzz of adrenaline in her veins was different from the stage lights. This wasn't the controlled spectacle of live TV. This was the chaos of public reaction. The unfiltered world deciding what the moment meant. She set the phone down for a breath, only to feel it buzz again. A text from her mother. Just 6 words. "You were raised right. Proud tonight." Jasmine's throat tightened. For all the headlines, all the noise, those 6 words struck deeper than anything else could. But not all the messages were like that. Reese, still hovering, cleared his throat. "You should see some of the headlines already." He hesitated before turning his laptop toward her. On the screen, A bold banner screamed, "Congresswoman Crockett lashes out at Maher in heated exchange." Another site followed with "Democrat meltdown on live TV." Jasmine stared, her lips pressing into a thin line. Lashes out, meltdown. The words were predictable, almost scripted. Part of the same playbook used every time a woman refused to shrink. She let out a short breath, half a laugh, half a sigh. "Every time we draw a boundary," she muttered, "they call it violence." Reese didn't answer. He didn't need to. The contrast was already clear. On one side, a wave of ordinary people replaying her composure as inspiration. On the other, institutions packaging the same composure as outrage, desperate to force it into a familiar frame. She leaned back against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes. The corridor buzzed with footsteps and chatter, crew members rushing to prepare for the next segment. Yet around her the world felt split in two. She could already see the lines being drawn, supporters quoting her with pride, critics weaponizing the same sentence as evidence of incivility. The twist wasn't that she was trending. She'd expected attention, even virality. The twist was how quickly the story was being reshaped, not by what she said, but by what others wanted it to mean. It was a reminder. This battle wasn't just fought on stage. It was fought in headlines, in hashtags, in the subtle language of bias that could turn calm defiance into a caricature of anger. Still, Jasmine handed the phone back to Reese with steady hands. "Let them spin," she said quietly. "We'll see what lasts longer, the headlines or the truth." By the time dawn painted the sky over Washington in faint streaks of gold, Jasmine's phone had already surrendered under the weight of notifications. Her inbox was a battlefield of subject lines: request for interview, CNN morning show. MSNBC would like you live at 9:15. NPR, all things considered. Can we get you in studio? Every major outlet wanted a piece of the moment. Reese sat at her kitchen counter with his laptop open, the screen a blur of incoming emails and calendar holds. "At least 20 so far," he muttered, scrolling quickly. "Producers are fighting over time slots." The hunger wasn't surprising. A single line, 7 words delivered without a raised voice, had exploded into the kind of viral clip that journalists live to dissect. What was surprising was the breadth of attention. Policy insiders wanted her thoughts on voting rights. Lifestyle shows wanted to ask about the power of calm. Even a cooking podcast had sent a request. "We'd love to discuss composure under heat." Jasmine let out a dry laugh. "They're not looking for answers," she said, sipping from a mug of reheated coffee. "They're looking for a reaction." If the mainstream platforms were eager, the conservative talk shows were ravenous. By 7 a.m., her face was splashed across cable chyrons with phrases like "Congresswoman meltdown" and "another angry progressive." Radio hosts scoffed into their microphones, mocking her line as woke poetry and sneering at the audience who had applauded. One pundit cracked, "If that's civility, I'd hate to see her rude." The laughter of his studio crew trailed into commercials, amplified for effect. Jasmine didn't flinch at the caricature. She'd lived through worse, but it was the subtler blows, the ones from inside her own ranks, that stung in a different way. On Twitter, a senior colleague from her party wrote, without tagging her name, "Leaders must remember that true influence is found in unity, not confrontation." Another posted, "Decorum matters. Shouting across the aisle isn't governing." The irony was sharp. She hadn't shouted once, yet the implication was unmistakable. Reese frowned at the screen, reading aloud the comments piling beneath. "Half the replies are defending you. Half are nodding along with him." He hesitated before adding, "Some of the people hesitating, they're supposed to be allies." That was the twist, the part the headlines wouldn't capture. It wasn't just the predictable backlash from political opponents. It was the pause, the hesitation from those who claimed to stand with her, people too cautious to applaud her firmness, too worried about optics to recognize composure for what it was. Even among allies, The cost of speaking truth was measured in distance. Endorsements suddenly quiet, retweets withheld, invitations delayed. Jasmine set her mug down carefully, her movements calm but weighted. "That's the real tax," she said softly. "Not the insults, not the jokes. It's watching the people who know better go silent." Her voice carried no bitterness, only the clarity of someone who had seen this cycle before. The applause of the moment followed by the retreat of those who feared its consequences. Outside, the city was stirring awake, traffic rumbling on wet pavement, newsstands stacking fresh papers with her face on the cover. Inside her kitchen, she sat in the eye of the storm, watching her words ripple outward, distorted and debated, magnified and minimized. She knew the wave would crest higher before it broke, but she also knew something else. Silence had weight, and now it wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to those who claimed to value truth, but couldn't quite stand beside it when the cameras turned. The hotel room was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the mini fridge, the faint traffic outside, the muffled voices from the TV she had muted hours ago. On screen, pundits' lips still moved, debating her every gesture, every pause, every choice of word. A scrolling chyron read, "Did Crockett go too far?" She left it silent, refusing to give them her ears. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone in her lap, untouched. Notifications stacked endlessly. Calls from producers, emails from staffers, text messages from colleagues who wanted to appear supportive without truly stepping into the fire. "Stay strong," they wrote, or "that was brave." Yet in between those words she could sense the hesitation, the fear of proximity to controversy. Her reflection in the dark window stared back at her. Not triumphant, not defeated, just thoughtful. She reached into her bag, pulled out the worn leather journal she carried everywhere, and opened it to a clean page. Pen in hand, she began to write, not a speech, not a rebuttal, not strategy, just words for herself. Not loud, just clear enough. She paused, looking at the sentence as if weighing it on a scale. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? People expected fireworks, shouting matches, viral outbursts, but what she gave them was different. A pause, a cut of precision, a refusal to play the caricature drawn for her. The room felt heavier as she leaned back against the headboard. Every voice she'd heard on television tonight echoed inside her head. Critics labeling her angry, commentators dissecting her body language, allies urging caution. She knew the cost of restraint would never trend. Social media rewarded fury, not patience. Headlines craved noise, not poise. Still, she felt a calm certainty settle over her. She wasn't trying to be the loudest in the room. She was trying to be the clearest. That distinction mattered, even if only a few understood it. She thought of her mother's text earlier that day. "You were raised right?" Simple, grounding words, cutting through the static. Her mother knew restraint was not weakness. It was discipline. It was choosing not to hand over your power, even when provoked. She closed the journal and set it gently on the nightstand. For a moment, she let her gaze rest on the ceiling, tracing the shadows of the curtains as the city lights flickered through. Was it worth it? She asked herself, not for the first time, and not for the last. In the silence, her answer came back steady. Yes, because the real victory was never about trending hashtags or viral clips dissected frame by frame. The real victory was refusing to be pulled into someone else's frame of battle. She had chosen her own ground. She had stood still when they expected her to swing wildly, and that stillness had unsettled them more than any raised voice could. She turned the TV off completely, plunging the room into deeper quiet. Tomorrow, she knew, the storm would still be raging. Requests, attacks, distortions, all of it waiting. But tonight, she had given herself what she rarely allowed. Stillness. The pen rested by the journal, her phone buzzing unanswered. And as she closed her eyes, She carried one truth with her into sleep. Her restraint was not absence. It was presence, sharpened to a point. That was the victory no headline could capture. The first wave arrived not through headlines, but through envelopes, piled in neat stacks on her desk. Letters bore the handwriting of strangers who felt suddenly less alone. A woman in her 60s, who had once been the only black vice president in her company, wrote, "I swallowed words in every boardroom I sat in. Watching you, I felt as though you finally released them for me." Another came from a retired pastor in Mississippi, who admitted that while he didn't agree with all her politics, he admired the way she held the line without raising her voice. "There is scripture about the power of a quiet tongue," he reminded her. "You lived it that night." The phone calls followed, pouring into her office in unpredictable waves. Staffers scrambled to take notes as teachers, veterans, and young activists offered pieces of their own history. One teacher said her students replayed the clip 3 times, trying to understand how someone could command a room with silence rather than volume. A nurse called during her night shift, confessing she'd nearly wept watching Jasmine hold her ground. "I've had supervisors dismiss me like that," she whispered, "but I never thought of looking back with that kind of strength." Not all responses came in public form. At a town hall, as Jasmine moved through a receiving line of constituents, an older woman leaned close so no one else could hear. "You said what I never could," she murmured. Her voice trembled as though decades of unspoken words pressed against her throat. Jasmine squeezed her hand in return, the silent gesture acknowledging what both women knew. Some victories live in the private corners of the soul. Social media, predictably, split in two. Supporters clipped the exchange into inspirational montages, overlaying her line about listening with images of young girls raising their hands in classrooms. Yet detractors launched their own campaigns, branding her as angry, shrill. Even though her tone had never lifted beyond steady calm, hashtags waged their miniature wars. But beneath the noise, something subtler emerged. Even critics admitted she had not lost her composure. "I don't like her politics," one conservative columnist wrote begrudgingly, "but she certainly held herself better than many on that stage." This grudging respect carried further than her allies expected. Community leaders who had once kept their distance reached out quietly. A college dean invited her to speak at a seminar on civic discourse. A coalition of interfaith pastors referenced her restraint in a sermon series about humility and courage. The irony was not lost on her team. The very qualities some networks condemned as lashing out were being interpreted by communities as discipline, even grace. At the end of one particularly long day, her assistant dropped a fresh stack of mail on her desk. Jasmine skimmed the return addresses: Texas, Ohio, Montana, red states, blue states, rural towns, big cities. The stories varied, but the refrain was the same. "Thank you for showing that dignity doesn't have to bow to ridicule." She closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her bones. The response was not unanimous, not even close, but it revealed a truth she carried with her. Impact was measured not by the volume of applause, but by the unexpected voices who finally felt seen. And in that, even her critics couldn't deny the point. Her composure had spoken louder than any slogan ever could. The morning light filtered through her office blinds, scattering into pale stripes across the desk stacked with envelopes, printed emails, and post-it notes. Most politicians ignored this kind of correspondence, but Jasmine leaned into it, pulling each one close like a thread in a tapestry. It was here that she saw the patterns others missed. Among the neat typewritten letters and carefully formatted emails, one stood out, a sticky note folded into an envelope. Its ink was uneven. The handwriting slanted in that way teenagers often have when trying to make their words look older than they are. Scrawled across it, in block letters, were the words she had spoken on live television. "I'm not here to perform. I'm here to tell the truth." At the bottom, the girl had added, "Thank you for saying what my teachers don't let me." Jasmine held the note between her fingers longer than the rest. imagining the girl's nervous hand pressing it to a wall, or maybe slipping it into the pages of a notebook where only she could see it. To most, it was nothing more than paper and ink. But to Jasmine, it was a signal, proof that her words had landed where they mattered most, in the quiet corners where young people were deciding who they were allowed to become. Later that week, a staffer arranged a virtual Zoom session with a group of high school students who had been following her story. Their faces filled the grid in neat squares, some with earbuds dangling, others in hoodies, a few with posters taped behind them. They didn't look like political activists. They looked like America's next chapter, still scribbling drafts of themselves. One girl raised her hand hesitantly. "Congresswoman," she said softly, "when you spoke, I felt seen, like you weren't just talking about politics. You were talking about me." She ducked her head as if the admission itself was too bold. Another voice chimed in, this time from a boy leaning against his chair with a basketball perched on his lap. "I didn't even know Congress had people like you," he admitted. "I thought it was just yelling in suits. But you," he hesitated, then grinned. "You didn't yell, you just stood there, and it worked." Jasmine smiled into the camera, her tone measured but warm. "That's the point. You don't always need to match the noise. Sometimes the power is in being steady, even when everything around you shakes." For those students, the moment had already grown beyond Maher's stage. It was no longer about a late-night host's jab or a pundit's panel. It had become something more enduring, a template for every young person told to shrink themselves, to speak softer, to fold into a corner and let others fill the room. And the irony was striking. The media still framed her exchange as combative, reducing it to a clip fit for trending hashtags. But for the teenagers watching from bedrooms and classrooms, what they remembered wasn't the sparring. It was the refusal to bend. As the session ended, one of the students typed into the chat box, visible only for a second before the call closed, "Don't let them change you. You're why I think I can change things too." Jasmine sat in the silence afterward, the glow of the laptop fading. For once, she didn't feel the weight of headlines or political calculations. What lingered instead was the sticky note, the whispered confession, the chat message that blinked and vanished, proof that her fight was no longer hers alone. The twist was undeniable. This wasn't about Bill Maher anymore. It was about every young voice learning that shrinking was optional and that being seen was a right, not a privilege. The backlash didn't only come from outside. It arrived, sharp and cloaked, from within her own political circle. The morning after her exchange with Maher was still being dissected on cable news. An older congressman, one who had been in office since the late 1980s, posted a thinly veiled comment on social media. "Leadership is measured in patience, not provocation," he wrote, never mentioning her name, but the implication was clear. For those who understood the rhythm of party politics, it was as loud as a shout. Cable pundits soon seized the tone, eager to frame the conflict as a generational rift. On one Sunday panel, a commentator smirked as she described Jasmine as divisive, her voice heavy with the suggestion that Jasmine was too bold, too unyielding, too unwilling to wait her turn. The word itself, divisive, was wielded like a knife, meant not just to describe, but to define, to box her into a role no politician wanted to carry. Jasmine watched the conversation unfold from a quiet corner of her office, phone buzzing with notifications. Advisors suggested drafting a response, maybe a clarifying statement, something to smooth the waters, but she didn't type a single word. She had already decided she would not give the storm more oxygen. Her critics wanted her to fight on their terms, to defend herself in a digital arena where the loudest voice always seemed to win. But she understood something deeper, that silence could be sharper than any reply. Her decision unsettled some allies. "If you don't answer, people will think you're conceding," one colleague warned during a hallway exchange. Jasmine only smiled. "Or," she said softly, "they'll realize I'm focused on something bigger than this moment." That distinction mattered to her, the difference between chasing attention and building momentum. Meanwhile, whispers traveled through the party. Some younger staffers admired her restraint, noting how rare it was in an era addicted to instant replies. Others feared the silence was risky, that it left too much space for opponents to shape the narrative. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She kept her head down, showing up at committee meetings, attending community briefings, and pushing legislation forward without once acknowledging the commentary swirling around her name. And in that choice, something unexpected began to happen. The very pundits who had branded her divisive started to remark on her discipline. "She's not taking the bait," one conservative anchor admitted grudgingly. "Say what you will about her politics, she's playing the long game." Even critics began to recognize the strategy in her restraint. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, Jasmine returned to her hotel room and finally glanced at her untouched phone. Hundreds of messages waited, some sharp, some supportive, many urging her to clap back. She set it down on the desk, pulled out her journal, and wrote a single line. "Silence is not surrender. Silence is choosing movement over moment." She underlined it twice, as if marking a promise to herself. The pushback within her party was real, and it stung, but she refused to let the noise distract her from the larger purpose. She wasn't here to win arguments on timelines. She was here to tilt history toward something steadier, something more lasting, and so she moved forward, not louder, not faster, but steadier. In a world addicted to instant spectacle, she was willing to gamble on patience. That was her defiance, her quiet rebellion against both her critics and the culture that demanded she always perform. She knew history rarely remembered the noise. It remembered who endured it. The headlines didn't soften with time. If anything, they sharpened. Within days, podcasts across the spectrum latched onto Jasmine's exchange. One described her as an activist in a suit, another as a performance piece disguised as a lawmaker. The clips replayed on loop, each show adding its own soundtrack of sarcasm or outrage. In one segment, a conservative host leaned forward, wagging his finger toward the camera. "She's performance, not policy. That's the whole problem with this new generation of politicians. They want applause, not laws." His audience laughed, but the line lingered, replayed, quoted, shared. On radio stations, callers chimed in, some sneering that she was grandstanding for likes, others predicting she would flame out as quickly as she rose. Comment threads filled with recycled barbs about her hair, her tone, her clothes, anything but the substance of what she had said. The scrutiny was not about argument, but about spectacle, the very thing her critics accused her of embodying. The irony was thick enough to taste. Jasmine sat in her office one evening, scrolling through a news feed filled with the storm. She stopped at the host's line, "She's performance, not policy," and quietly exhaled. For a moment, she let the words hang in the silence, hearing the way they echoed far beyond the intent. They weren't wrong about Congress being a stage. She had studied enough history to know that lawmakers had always spoken as much to the gallery as to the record, to the cameras as to their colleagues. It wasn't new. The only difference now was that someone like her had seized the microphone. She didn't rush to post a rebuttal. She didn't book a counter-interview or issue a press release. Her aides watched her, waiting for a signal, but she only shook her head and returned to the stack of bills on her desk. "They'll say what they say," she told them. "We don't need to chase noise with more noise." That decision unsettled some of her younger staffers who wanted to clap back online, to fight fire with fire. But Jasmine knew that amplifying the backlash only fed it. Silence, this time, was the sharper move. Meanwhile, in coffee shops and community halls, the so-called performance was being dissected in ways her critics hadn't anticipated. A civics teacher told his class, "This is what the chamber was always meant to be, a place where truth meets power." A pastor noted during Sunday service that every sermon was a kind of performance, too. "Performance isn't empty if the message is real," he said. People nodded, recognizing the paradox. The very stage that was being mocked had turned into a pulpit for a deeper conversation. The backlash carried its own energy, and in trying to minimize her, critics had magnified her. Every insult recycled the clip. Every dismissal replayed her words. Every accusation reminded audiences of the moment. They thought they were shrinking her, but instead they were spreading her. In the calculus of public life, that was no small victory. By the end of the week, Jasmine closed her laptop and placed her phone face down. Her staff was tense, still monitoring the tide of punditry, but she was calmer than she had been in days. Congress has always been a stage, she finally murmured, half to herself, half to the room. I just didn't ask permission to step into the spotlight. It wasn't defiance so much as clarity, a recognition that the critique itself had confirmed her place. The backlash, in the end, had only proven her point. The house in Dallas was still dark when Jasmine padded into the kitchen. The old clock on the wall hummed softly, its hands pushing toward 6. She reheated yesterday's coffee in the microwave, the sound too loud for such a quiet dawn. She wrapped her hands around the chipped mug, leaned against the counter, and let the silence settle. For once, no reporters, no committee schedules, no speeches, just the faint hum of appliances and the smell of reheated coffee cutting through the stillness. Reese, her longtime aide and now something closer to family, came in with a stack of papers under his arm. His shirt was wrinkled, tie loose, the look of someone who had already been working since before sunrise. He laid the stack on the counter and flipped through the top pages. 20 interview requests since midnight, he said. Cable networks, podcasts, late-night talk shows. Everybody wants a reaction? Jasmine raised an eyebrow, took a sip of coffee. The warmth did little to shake off the fatigue. Do they want policy? She asked slowly. Or just reaction? Reese didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a chair back and sank into it, running his hands over his face. Mostly reaction, he admitted. They want you to relitigate what happened on air. They want fireworks. She let the words hang in the air. Fireworks, noise, distraction. It was tempting. She knew the attention would draw donations, airtime, a chance to speak her truth on a larger stage. But she also knew the trap. Once you became a fixture of spectacle, it was hard to return to substance. She placed her mug down with a gentle thud and looked out the kitchen window. The street outside was empty, save for a jogger cutting through the neighborhood. Jasmine's mind drifted back to the countless mothers and students who had written her letters, thanking her not for being loud, but for being steady. They weren't looking for her to clap back on every insult. They were asking her to keep the long fight alive. Reese broke the silence again. If we turn them all down, people will say you're hiding. She gave a small smile, half amused, half weary. Let them. Reese blinked. You sure? Jasmine pulled out the chair opposite him and sat, folding her hands. I didn't come here to play their game. I came here to change the rules. If I run to every microphone shoved in my face, then I'm not leading. I'm following their script. Her words carried no bitterness, only resolve. She thought of how quickly moments could burn bright and then vanish, leaving nothing but ash. Movements, on the other hand, demanded patience. Patience meant building something that could last beyond her, something that didn't crumble when the cameras turned away. Reese tapped his pen against the stack of papers. So we let the requests pile up? We sift, she corrected gently. If someone wants to talk about policy, real policy, I'll show up. But if they just want to gawk at a feud, they can find someone else. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, patience over spotlight. She lifted her mug again, the steam finally fading from the reheated coffee. Outside, the jogger had disappeared, replaced by the first school bus lumbering down the street. Dawn had officially broken, and with it, another day of pressure. But Jasmine felt lighter. Refusing the bait wasn't retreat, it was discipline. As she stood to refill her mug, she murmured almost to herself, A spotlight fades. A steady flame endures. The kitchen filled with the faint sound of birdsong, as if affirming her choice. She smiled at the quiet, letting it carry her into the day. The late-night quiet of Jasmine's office was broken only by the faint hum of the desk lamp. Papers lay scattered across the table. Policy drafts, interview notes, clipped headlines that branded her everything from fearless to reckless. Her phone buzzed once, and the familiar name on the screen made her pause. It was her mentor, a retired congresswoman who had walked through storms long before Jasmine ever set foot in the chamber. She answered softly, her voice lower than usual, as if to avoid stirring the silence around her. The older woman's tone was steady, the kind that carried both authority and warmth. History remembers who kept their dignity, not who shouted loudest. The words didn't come as advice, they came as a reminder, one seasoned by years of scars and survival. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, letting the sentence sink, her fingertips pressing lightly against her temple. For a moment, she didn't reply. The instinct to defend herself, to explain, to fight the noise of criticism, it was there, burning at the edges. But instead of speaking, she chose stillness. She let silence do the work, as though agreeing not with words but with breath. Her mentor continued, voice softening. They will tempt you to spend your energy in the arena of sound bites. Don't. Power that lasts is not measured in volume, but in the weight of choices. You already know this. You proved it when you didn't take their bait. Jasmine closed her eyes, recalling the swarm of pundits calling her divisive, the flood of comments urging her to clap back online. She remembered scrolling through them late at night, the pull to respond like an itch beneath the skin. But she hadn't. She had resisted. And now, hearing her mentor's words, that choice felt less like hesitation and more like wisdom. Sometimes, her mentor added, dignity is the loudest sound in the room. The line struck, not as a metaphor, but as a lived truth. Jasmine's silence had unsettled her critics more than any rebuttal could. They wanted sparks, and instead she gave them stone. They wanted noise, and she offered composure. And in that gap, people had begun to wonder if the absence of reaction was itself a kind of response. Jasmine opened her eyes, the glow of the desk lamp reflecting in her steady gaze. So, you think stillness is not weakness? She said finally. Her mentor chuckled, the sound rich with recognition. Stillness is strategy. Ask anyone who's lived long enough to see the tides turn. You're not shrinking back. You're letting them exhaust themselves. The moment will pass, but the record remains. Let your record speak. The call ended not with ceremony, but with quiet reassurance. Jasmine set the phone down and looked at the clutter on her desk, seeing it differently now, not as a battlefield, but as building blocks. Each draft, each note, each plan was weightier than a headline. She sat there in silence, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like command. She realized her mentor was right. Stillness was not retreat. It was a stance, deliberate and sharp as any word spoken into a microphone. And so, when she finally rose to leave, she didn't feel smaller. She felt anchored. The critics would keep shouting, but she had chosen the rarer weapon, patience. In time, it would not be the noise that history replayed. It would be the calm voice that stood unshaken, proving that dignity itself could be louder than any storm. The morning bell rang in a middle school in Tulsa, the kind of sharp chime that pulled students from chatter into a restless quiet. In a civics classroom, sunlight streamed through half-open blinds, cutting thin lines of gold across the whiteboard. The teacher, Miss Daniels, stood at the front with a remote in her hand and a purpose in her eyes. She didn't begin with a lecture or a worksheet. Instead, she pressed play. On the screen flickered the clip, the one that had already traveled across news shows and social feeds. The image of Jasmine Crockett sitting tall, steady, and unflinching filled the classroom. The students leaned forward, some whispering as the scene unfolded. The teacher let it play without interruption, her arms folded, watching their faces more than the video itself. When it ended, silence hung in the room for several seconds. It wasn't the silence of boredom, it was the silence of thought. "All right," Ms. Daniels finally said, her voice calm but firm. "What did you just see?" A boy in the back raised his hand. She didn't yell. She didn't roll her eyes. She just sat there. Another student, a girl with braids, chimed in without waiting to be called. She looked calm but not weak, like she already knew what they said didn't matter. Miss Daniels nodded and replayed the clip, this time pausing halfway through. She circled Jasmine's posture with the laser pointer. "Notice this. She doesn't shrink, doesn't flinch. She holds her space." She clicked again, freezing on Jasmine's subtle smile. And this moment, why do you think she smiled? The room buzzed with guesses. Maybe to show she wasn't bothered. Maybe it was sarcastic. Maybe it was to remind herself she had control. The teacher didn't give them an answer. Instead, she leaned on the desk. When we talk about bullying, we usually focus on what's said, but power is also in how you respond, or don't respond. The students exchanged looks, realizing the discussion had shifted from politics to their own hallways. The clip became more than just news, it became a mirror. One boy confessed, almost reluctantly, "When kids pick on me, I get mad. I shout back. It always makes it worse." A girl across the room nodded. "My cousin told me once, sometimes the best clapback is no clapback, just showing they don't control your mood." Ms. Daniels let the words linger, then said softly, "Exactly. Dignity is its own kind of defense." The class went quiet again, but this time the quiet felt like respect. By the end of the period, the conversation had shifted into questions bigger than schoolyard teasing. A student asked, "Does Congress really work like this? People just trying to embarrass each other?" Another wondered, "If the government is a stage, like people say, does that mean we're the audience or the directors?" Ms. Daniels smiled. "That's why we're watching this, because civic lessons aren't only in textbooks. Sometimes they're in the moments that go viral, and you get to decide what lesson you carry from them." As the bell rang and students shuffled out, one girl lingered, her notebook open. She had scribbled in big letters, "Strength, composure." She tapped her pencil, as if committing the idea to memory. The clip that began as political theater had been reframed inside a classroom of 13-year-olds as something else entirely, a lesson in resilience, posture, and the quiet power of self-control. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about teaching them, without a single textbook, that sometimes the strongest move is simply to stand or sit unshaken. The office was quieter than usual. A stack of unopened mail sat in the corner, sunlight cutting across the room in long diagonal beams. The interns lingered near the door, unsure if they should break the silence. Jasmine, finishing a note on a yellow legal pad, glanced up with that steady half-smile that always felt like permission. One of the interns, a college sophomore with nervous energy, finally asked, "How do you know when to speak up?" His voice trembled as though he was asking about more than politics, maybe about life itself. Jasmine set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. She didn't answer immediately. She let the silence expand, as if to demonstrate the very thing he was trying to understand. Finally, as she said, "When silence feels heavier than the risk, that's when you speak. Not just because you can, but because you can't bear not to." The room shifted. The other interns sat a little straighter. It wasn't just advice, it was instruction born from experience. She wasn't offering them a slogan. They'd heard plenty of those in this city. She was offering a compass. Another intern, quieter, more skeptical, spoke. "How do you not get angry? After everything people say, how do you stay calm?" The question hung in the air. Jasmine folded her hands together, studied them for a moment, and then looked up with eyes that carried both fatigue and resolve. "Anger doesn't need volume to be real. she answered. People confuse shouting with strength, but real strength is knowing you're already right, and you don't have to prove it with noise. The young woman nodded slowly, as if something long tangled inside her had just been untied. Jasmine could see it, how their faces absorbed each word, how they etched her sentences into memory. These weren't sound bites for television. They were lifelines, shaping how the next generation would stand their ground. For a moment, Jasmine remembered her own early days, the doubt, the feeling of walking into rooms where every gaze dared her to falter. Back then, she had mistaken composure for weakness. Now she knew better. Stillness was not surrender. It was control. The interns began asking more questions, small ones about politics and big ones about resilience. She responded to each without rush, choosing her words with the same discipline she had shown in that viral clip. And then it hit her. This wasn't about the clip anymore. That moment had already taken on a life of its own, carried into classrooms, sermons, and conversations she would never hear. What mattered now was that the message was outliving the headline. It was no longer tied to her posture, or her expression, or even her name. It was traveling through them, through these young people who would soon step into their own battles. When the interns finally rose to leave, Jasmine stayed in her chair, listening to the faint echo of their footsteps down the hall. She understood then, history rarely remembers the noise. It remembers the lesson. And her lesson, about patience, dignity, and unshaken truth, was no longer hers alone. The screen fades to black, then slowly reopens, not on a courtroom, not on Congress, but on a blank stage lit by a single spotlight. A narrator's voice begins, calm yet carrying weight. Where have you made yourself smaller just to survive a room? The question hangs in the silence, almost accusatory, yet not cruel. It's an invitation, a mirror held up to anyone listening. Images begin to fill the stage. Ordinary people, a nurse tugging her sleeves down in a staff meeting, afraid to speak, a young student lowering her hand because she thinks her answer will be mocked, an older man swallowing words in a town hall because he doesn't trust his accent to be respected. Each of them, in their own way, shrinks. The narrator presses further. When did silence become easier than truth? When did shrinking feel safer than standing tall? The camera shifts to Jasmine alone at her desk, reviewing notes in the dim glow of a desk lamp. She closes the folder slowly, exhales, and looks up as though she can feel the weight of those voices across the country. She doesn't say much, but her presence answers the question. Sometimes, resisting the urge to collapse into silence is its own form of courage. Back in the montage, more scenes unfold. A teenager stands up to a bully in the cafeteria. A mother in a church meeting quietly raises her hand and says, "That isn't right." A worker challenges his boss, not with shouting, but with steady truth. None of them are loud. None of them storm the room. Yet every one of them claims space. The narration sharpens into a call. Stop shrinking. Stop handing away your inches of dignity. The world will never give you the space you deserve. You must take it. The words echo with strength, each syllable a drumbeat. And then comes the twist. The final image is of a classroom projector. The clip of Jasmine's confrontation plays one more time. A student in the back whispers the line almost unconsciously, not to mimic but to claim, "I'm not being small." The camera lingers on that student's face, young, uncertain, yet radiant with recognition. The line is no longer Jasmine's alone. It belongs to them, to everyone who ever swallowed their voice, to everyone who has ever felt the need to shrink just to pass unnoticed. The narrator closes with quiet certainty. That's the legacy of one stand. A sentence once spoken in self-defense becomes a promise for millions. You are not small. You never were. Fade out. Silence. Then the words appear across the screen in bold white letters. I'm not being small. This time, it's no longer a defense. It's a declaration.